We thank you again today for being with us in our Bible study as we study the important topic of problem of human suffering. Last week, we were talking about some ways in which we suffer physically. We talked about sickness, death, growing old, accidents, persecution, poverty. All of these are ways in which we suffer physically. And today, I'd like for us to begin to talk about some ways in which we suffer mentally and emotionally. And I suppose the most prevalent way is through worry. Now, many people worry about various things, and worry, hurry, and bury are three words that characterize our lives today. We worry about a number of things, we're in a hurry to do different things, and we bury our dead. But what do we worry about? Well, the list is almost endless. People worry about failure in some way. It may be a young lady who's planning to get married, and then her boyfriend drops her, and she's worried that she'll never be able to get married. Or it may be a young person in high school or college, and he worries about failing a certain course. We fail in various ways, and failure leads to worry. And sometimes we worry about marital problems. Many people get married and then try to blend two lives together, and sometimes there are problems. In fact, I suppose all married people have some problems. I hear sometimes of someone who said, "My wife and I have been married for 40 years, and we've never had a disagreement." But you'd better watch a man like that. He'll lie about other things as well. Now, that's being a little facetious, but I don't believe that two people who are so different can come together in a marriage without having some problems. Many people have come to me for marriage counseling, members of the church and those who are not members of the church. But many people worry about problems in marriage. And then some people worry about what people think about them. All of us are concerned about what people think about us. Sometimes we worry because we think no one cares. Obviously, a person would be concerned about it if he thinks no one cares about it. Sometimes we worry about illness. We may have some sort of illness that we think may lead into something more dangerous, and so we try to be careful about that, but we worry about it. I'm confident that there are many people today who are worried about COVID-19. Some people don't have it, but they're worrying about getting it. There's a difference in being concerned about something and worrying about it. We ought to be concerned about this disease. We ought to use good judgment and wisdom and try to avoid it, but then we don't need to worry about it. We need to do what we can, depend upon God, do the best we can. Sometimes we worry about the future, worried about how we're going to live in the future and whether we're going to have our job or whether everything's going to be all right for the future, and we worry about it. But remember that Jesus said in Matthew 6 and verse 34, "Take therefore no thought for the morrow, for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." So Jesus is saying, don't add tomorrow's worries to today's worries. Tomorrow will have worries enough of its own. Just live for today. And so there are many ways in which we can worry. Now, the question is, what can we do about it? How can we overcome this problem of worry? Well, first of all, you need to analyze it. I'd like to suggest 6 things that can help you overcome worry. And the first is to sit down and analyze it. Think about it. Think about what's causing you to worry. Think about what you're worrying about, and then determine that you're not going to worry about something that you can help. There are some things you can do, and you won't have to worry about it. If you can help it, obviously you ought to do that rather than worrying about it. And then second, you need to determine that you're not going to worry about that which you cannot help. There are some things that you'll not be able to help. And so it doesn't help to worry about those things. Sit down and analyze those things. And then number 2, pray about it. Christians are able to pray. We ought to use the power of prayer. Many times we suffer in various ways when we could go to God in prayer about it, turn it over to Him. In Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, Paul said, "Be careful for nothing." Now that's the King James reading, and it is not as clear as it is in the American Standard Version. The American Standard Version tells us, "In nothing be anxious, But in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. And so we can pray about those matters. Brother George Bailey was a great gospel preacher in the last few generations. He passed away a few years ago at the age of 97. I've heard Brother Bailey talking about this particular passage, and he says there is nothing that lies beyond the power of prayer except that which lies beyond the will of God. If it is not within the will of God, then there's no need praying for that thing to happen. God's not going to do something that is contrary to His will. And so we need to pray about everything that's within the will of God. Paul tells us that we can have peace then if we don't worry about that thing. Go to God about it in prayer, and the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. We need to turn it over to God and then leave it with Him. I heard about a man who was always worrying about this and that, and it caused him to have a sour disposition. He was always negative in his outlook. He was always complaining about something because he was always worried about something. His fellow workers didn't want to be around him. But one day he came to work and he was a different man. He had a bright, cheery disposition, seemed to be happy, and he didn't seem to be worrying about anything. And a fellow worker asked him, what happened to you? Did you take a pill of some sort? He said, no, I just determined that I was not going to worry about anything anymore. In fact, I have hired a professional worrier to worry for me. When I'm about to worry about something, I just call this man and let him worry about it. It's pretty expensive, though. It costs me about $1,000 a week. And the other worker said, I know about how much money you make. How can you afford to pay $1,000 a week to someone to worry for you? And the man said, I don't know. I just turn it over to him and let him worry about it. That's what we need to do with our worries. Turn them over to God and let Him worry about them. God has the power and the wisdom to know what to do about it. So first of all, analyze it. Secondly, pray about it. And then third, take action, appropriate action. If you're worried about not having enough money to live on, maybe you need to change jobs to get a better job. Or maybe you need to get a second job. Or perhaps you need to scale down your level of living. But there are different things that can be done, but you need to investigate that worry and then determine what you're going to do about it and take action. And then number 3 is acceptance. There comes a time when you may have to accept something. You may worry about it, you pray about it, you do what you can about it, but God doesn't see fit to remove it. And you might have to just accept it. If prayer and appropriate action does not remove the cause of this worry, then we need to accept it. Paul had to do that in regard to that thorn in the flesh. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. He prayed about it 3 times, and God didn't see fit to remove it. It was needful for Paul to keep it and keep him humble. And so Paul just accepted it and lived with it. We too need to accept some things. We need to think about what we have left and not that which we have lost. You remember Helen Keller that we talked about some time ago. Helen Keller was blind and deaf, but she was a wild young lady. And then her parents hired Annie Sullivan to come and teach her. Now, Annie Sullivan was called a miracle worker. It was not a miracle in the Bible sense, but it was an amazing thing. She taught that young lady and taught her to think about and use what she has left rather than what she had lost. So sometimes we need to accept our situation because it's not going to change with us. I had a friend one time who had that kind of attitude. He had diabetes, and the doctors thought they had to cut off one of his legs and feet, or foot, one of his feet. So the doctors cut it off, and then I was visiting with him after he came back from surgery, and he was awake, and he said, Charlie, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to donate that foot and leg to you, and you can use it as a soup bone. It was not very appetizing, but I was glad to see that he had a good attitude and he could joke about it, and he was accepting the situation. I don't know how many people he made that offer to. They'd come in to see him, and he'd say, I'm going to give that leg and soup bone or leg to, and you can use it for a soup bone. Sometimes we have to just accept things as they are. When we've done everything that we can do, and we've prayed about it, and God has not seen fit to change it. And then number 5, we need to get involved in serving other people and think about their problems and needs. One of the reasons we worry is the fact that we're thinking about our problems and our needs. But if we change our focus and begin to think about other people and their problems, and we begin to help them with their problems, then our worry about our own problems will leave us. We need to be concerned about other people, and then we can forget about our own problems. I believe I can give you a money-back guarantee on that. If you're worrying about some of your problems, if you will begin to think about other people and their problems and begin to help them with theirs, in all probability, you won't be thinking about your own problems. And then number 6, and this is vital, trust God. Remember the teaching of Paul in Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. Now, Paul says that God is able to make all of these things work together for your good. They may not be good now, but God is able to make them work together for our good. In verse 31, just 3 verses later, he said, if God be for us, who can be against us? If God is on our side, if he's for us, doesn't matter who's on the other side. We're going to be victorious. In verse 37, he said, we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. We're not just conquerors, we are more than conquerors. And so Paul teaches us to trust God, lean upon him. But then notice what he said in the last 2 verses of that chapter. For I am persuaded that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God. God loves us. Nothing can separate us from that love. And so we need to trust God, lean upon him. We also need to go to the Lord's Sermon on the Mount, in that section in which he tells us not to worry. In Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, he said, therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat or what ye shall drink, nor yet for your body what ye shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body than raiment? So Jesus is telling us in this particular section that worry is unnecessary. God has given you the greater blessing of your life. Don't you think he's going to give you the lesser blessing of meat for your life? God gave you the greater blessing of your body. Don't you think he is able to give you the lesser blessing of clothing for your body? And so God will take care of us. In fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is telling us that God is like the pillars under a bridge. Now, you've crossed over a vast section of water on a bridge. You can't see the bridge, the pillars under the bridge. You can't see them go down into the water, but you trust them. You don't worry about those pillars under the bridge, and yet they were made by men. If we trust those pillars to hold up that bridge, and those pillars were made by men, surely we ought to trust in God. He is like those pillars. He undergirds our lives. He holds us up and sustains us. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, in this section on worry, Jesus tells us that we ought not to worry because it's unnecessary. And then in the next verse, verse 26, he said, behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns. Yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are ye not much better than they? Jesus says, look at those birds. Learn a lesson from those birds. Now, those birds don't sow. They don't reap and gather the fruit into the barns. And yet God takes care of them. God feeds those birds. Now, if God takes care of the birds, surely he'll take care of us. Did you ever know of a bird that had a nervous breakdown because he was worried about what he's going to eat tomorrow? Did you ever hear of a bird that had ulcers because he was worrying about what he's going to eat tomorrow? God takes care of the birds, and he will take care of us. And so Jesus says, worry is unnecessary. God's going to take care of it. Then he says that worry is unproductive. In verse 27, he said, which of you, by taking thought, can add 1 cubit unto his stature? Now, a cubit is about 18 inches, about from the elbow to the end of the finger. Can you grow 18 inches by worrying about it? Suppose you were about the height of a midget and you wanted to be taller. You wanted to be a cubit taller. Could you grow 18 inches by worrying about it? Obviously, you cannot. The question that Jesus asked, of course, indicates that you can't do it. Now, my legs are long enough, they reach the ground. That's the most important thing. But I've always wanted to be a little taller. But I don't worry about it. And wishing I were taller or worrying about it wouldn't make me grow any taller. I don't have any trouble growing out this way, but I have little trouble growing up taller. But Jesus teaches that we ought not to worry about those things. It won't do any good. Worry is unnecessary. Worry is unproductive. Worrying is about like rocking in a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but it doesn't get you anywhere. Now, you can sit in that rocking chair and begin to rock if you can get it going, and then you don't have to worry about it. You just sit there and rock. But then at the end of the day, you'll be right there. You won't go anywhere. Rocking is unproductive. Worrying is also unproductive. And then Jesus tells us that worry is unbecoming to a Christian. In verse 31, he tells us, take no thought or don't worry about these things. What shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or wherewithal shall we be clothed? He said, don't worry about those things. For after all these things do the Gentiles seek. Now, the Gentiles were not God's people. And Jesus is saying, you expect them to worry about those things. They don't have any God to take care of them. But you are Christians. You don't need to worry about it. In verse 33, he said, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. And so Jesus is saying worry is unbecoming to a Christian. In Mark chapter 4, Jesus and the apostles started to cross over the lake in a boat, and Jesus lay down to take a nap. And a great storm came up, and the winds began to blow fiercely, and the waves began to blow against that boat. And the disciples became worried and afraid. They awakened Jesus and said, Master, carest thou not that we perish? Jesus arose then and said, Peace be still. And the winds and the waves obeyed his word. But then Jesus said to his apostles, Why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith? And so they were worrying because they were weak in faith. Worry is unbecoming to a Christian. Now, there's room for anxiety in our life if we are in a storm and Jesus is not in our boat. If we're not Christians, if we're not serving him, we have a right to be afraid. But if Jesus is in our boat, if Jesus is in our lives, we don't need to be afraid. And so we need to trust God. Now, I've given 6 principles that will help us to overcome our worry. If we will put them into practice, I'm confident that we won't worry nearly as much. The more faith we have, the less we will worry. A second way in which we suffer mentally and emotionally is through fear. Now, fear can be a dangerous thing, but it is not always bad. Sometimes fear protects us. We use fear to teach our children to avoid dangerous things. We try to make them afraid of going out into the street. We tell them if you go out into the street, a car may hit you and run over you and hurt you. And so we hope that fear of being hit by a car will keep them from running out into that street. And we teach our children, don't drink anything from a bottle or anything unless we give it to you. I was preaching for a congregation years ago in which there was a man who couldn't speak. And I learned that when he was a little toddler, he had opened the doors under the sink, and in the cabinet underneath the sink, his mother was keeping a number of strong and powerful cleaners. Some of them were dangerous. And that little boy, as a toddler, picked up one of the containers and drank it, and it ruined his vocal cords, and he couldn't speak. It's good for us to use fear to try to teach our children not to do certain things because it is a protection to them. A function of fear is to lead us away from evil. In Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 13, Solomon said, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Now that's fear God, respect and reverence for God. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 20, Paul said, them that sin rebuke before all, that others also may fear. It was his desire that when someone sees another who's rebuked for sin, even an elder, then it should encourage him not to sin. In Hebrews 11 in verse 7, the scripture says, by faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared a boat or an ark to the saving of his soul, saving of his house. He was able to save his house because of his faith in God. His faith led him to fear God with reverence and respect and obey the will of God. And so one function of fear is to turn us away from evil and turn us to that which is right and good. The other side of the coin is that the Bible teaches us not to fear in one way. In 2 Timothy 1 in verse 7, Paul said, for God hath not given to us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. There is a fear that's wrong, and that fear comes from the devil and not from God. This is a neurotic fear instead of courage to obey the Lord. Now, that's a lack of faith in God. Suppose I teach a person in a Bible class and encourage them to obey the gospel. But he says, I'm afraid to become a Christian. I'm afraid that I can't live the Christian life. I'm afraid I will fail. Well, he's afraid to obey the gospel, but that fear doesn't come from God. That fear comes from the devil. Or suppose it's a Christian who is taught that he ought to give to God and give liberally to the Lord, and that God will bless him for it. But he says, I'm afraid to do that. I'm afraid I won't be able to make my payments on my house or my car. And so he's afraid to launch out and do that which God teaches him to do. Though the Bible says, give and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, shall the Lord give, or shall men give into your bosoms. And so sometimes people are afraid to obey the Lord. They're afraid they can't do it. But that is a neurotic fear instead of having faith in God. Too much of this kind of fear can destroy our peace of mind, and it can destroy our joy and happiness in life. I heard the story of a little boy who had a part in a school play. It was a Christian school, apparently. They were having a play that involved a story about Jesus. And this little boy was to repeat the words of Christ, it is I, be not afraid. And he practiced it with the class over and over again. It is I, be not afraid. But when they came together to present that play in the auditorium, that night the auditorium was filled with parents and grandparents and friends. When that little boy walked out on the stage and he saw all those people, he said, it's me and I'm scared to death. Sometimes people are afraid, and that kind of fear will rob us of our joy and peace and happiness in life. I have known of cases like that in which people were very much afraid, and it robs them of joy and peace and confidence in life. In Genesis chapter 15 and verse 1, God said to Abram, fear not, Abram, I am thy shield. Now, a shield was perhaps 3 feet long, a couple of feet wide, and on the back of it were 2 straps where a man could put his arms through them and hold that thing up in front of them and protect them from the blows of the enemy. God said, fear not, Abram, I am thy shield. God would protect him, and God would protect us as well. And in 1 John 4, verse 18, John said, there is no fear in love, for perfect love casteth out fear. And so we need to get rid of this fear in our lives. It's not a good thing at all, but what causes it? Well, sometimes fear is caused by a guilty conscience. Sometimes when we do wrong, our conscience bothers us. It hurts us. We suffer with a guilty conscience. In Proverbs 13 and verse 15, Solomon said, the way of transgressors is hard. It is hard. When one transgresses, his conscience can eat him alive. I heard the story of a man who wrote a letter to the IRS, Internal Revenue Service, He didn't sign the letter, but he said, "Dear sirs, I didn't pay all of my taxes for last year, and my conscience is bothering me. I haven't been able to sleep at night. Enclosed, you will find $100. And then P.S., if I still can't sleep, I'll send you the rest of it." There are people who have a guilty conscience, and they suffer as a result of it. Adam and Eve had that kind of conscience. In Genesis chapter 3, after they had sinned by disobeying God and eating the forbidden fruit, God came walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and Adam and Eve hid themselves. And Adam admitted it was because of fear. Their conscience bothered them because they knew they had disobeyed the will of God. Sometimes fear is caused by ignorance. Sometimes we don't know some things and we're afraid because we don't know them. Think of little children, for example. They are afraid of the darkness. Why is that? Well, they don't know what's out there in the darkness, and they have vivid imaginations, and they may think there's something out there that may get them or hurt them. I heard the story of a young mother who was working in the kitchen one night preparing some food for the next day, and her little daughter, about 5 years old, was there with her, and the mother dropped something on the floor, and she asked her little girl to go out on the back porch and get the broom and bring it in to her. And the little girl opened the door to go out, and it was dark outside. And she closed the door and said, "Mommy, I'm afraid to go out there. It's dark out there." And the mother said, "Well, honey, you know that God is everywhere. He's even on the back porch, and He'll take care of you. Go out there and get the broom and bring it in to me." The little girl went back and opened the door slightly. And she said, "God, if you're out there, will you please hand me that broom?" Sometimes we are afraid of the unknown. Little girls, little boys are afraid of darkness because they don't know what's out there. But sometimes adults can be afraid as well when they don't know something. If an adult is about to go into surgery, he's never been put to sleep before, never had surgery before, so he may be a little bit afraid, not knowing what it's going to be like. I think I've had that experience. About the first time I was going to be put to sleep, the anesthesiologist was preparing me for the surgery and getting me ready to put me to sleep. And I said, "Are you sure you can put me to sleep?" And he says, "I think we can manage it." And then in a little while, he said, "Okay, it's time." And just like that, I was put to sleep. But not knowing what it's going to be like sometimes can cause us a little fear. Children sometimes are afraid like that, and adults as well. Even adults can be frightened that way. The real cause of fear in many cases is unbelief. Remember that statement from Christ in Mark chapter 4, when He said to the apostles when they were afraid and awakened Him, He said, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" So the real cause sometimes is simply a lack of faith. Now, the approach of death sometimes can cause fear. Sometimes we are afraid of death. We don't need to be afraid of it if we're Christians. In John chapter 14, verse 27, Jesus said, "Peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you, but be not afraid." Jesus teaches His apostles that they should not be afraid. Death was designed to be a blessing to God's people. In Psalm 116 in verse 15, the psalmist said, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His saints." It's designed to be a blessing for Christians. Now, we don't need to be afraid of dying. It is said that George Washington, the president of our country in the beginning, was terrified at the thought of being buried alive. And so he insisted that after his death, his burial is not to take place for at least 3 days after he was declared dead. That way, they'll be sure that he is dead. He was afraid of being buried alive. So sometimes people are afraid of dying in various ways. But death was designed to be a gain to us. In Philippians 1:21, Paul said, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Death can be a gain to God's people. In Psalm 23, verse 4, in the shepherd psalm, David said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." David was not afraid to go through that valley of the shadow of death because God would walk it with him. and He'll walk it with us as well. Fear can be a destructive thing. It can rob us of peace and joy in life. You remember the story of the sinking of the Titanic. That ship was built over in England, and then it left Liverpool to go to America on its maiden voyage, the first voyage it would make. And it was, I think they had 2,100 people plus on that ship. But they didn't have enough lifeboats. They thought it was unsinkable. One person said even God Himself couldn't sink the Titanic. He didn't know God very well. But they set out on that trip, and in the night, up in the North Atlantic, they hit an iceberg. That iceberg tore a hole in the side of that ship, and water began to come in, and that ship began to list that way because water filling up the area where the hole was made. People began to slide off that ship into the water. When they determined that the ship was going to sink, they began to put people in lifeboats and put them out in the water. But they were in grave danger, and they were all so afraid they didn't use good judgment. Some of the lifeboats were almost empty. Some of them were only half filled. And when those lifeboats were put down into the water, there were some people out in the water swimming around because they'd fallen off the top of that ship. And they tried to get into some of these lifeboats where there was plenty of room. But the people in those lifeboats were so afraid, they used oars, the oars from those boats, to knock those people off the boats back into the water. Those people in the boats were so afraid that if others got into the boat would sink and they would all drown. And so fear led those people to cause other people to die in the waters. Now, fear is a destructive thing, as you can see, and it can rob us of joy and happiness in life. The case of the Titanic is a case in point. I met a woman on one occasion who was on the Titanic that night. Back when I was a young preacher, I was preaching in Wildwood, Florida, on my first tour of duty there. And there was a friend of one of our families who came to church with him one day. He was from another state and was visiting with them and came to church services with them. I had an opportunity to meet her. I didn't know very much about the Titanic then, and I just met her and didn't really talk to her. But now I wish I had the opportunity to talk with her in private and to talk with her about her experiences and what she saw among the people on that occasion. I did not have that opportunity. But I do know one thing about those people. They were filled with fear, and they caused a number of other people to die because of their fears. They would knock them off the boats as they were trying to get into those lifeboats. Fear can be destructive. Now, the question is, what can we do about our fear? The cure of fear is revealed in the Bible. Gaining insight, of course, will be our first consideration. We need to determine why we're afraid. Of what are we afraid? We need to have some insight, look into the problem. And then if you find that you are afraid because you're afraid of dying and being lost, if you have sinned and you are afraid because of that sin, you need to take care of that. You can be forgiven of sin by obeying the Lord if you're not a Christian. You can obey the gospel, you can become a Christian. All those sins can be forgiven, and you don't need to be afraid of the judgment day. If you have been a Christian, but you have sinned, and you need to come back and make things right, you can do that. Confess the sin, repent of it, pray for forgiveness, 1 John 1:9 and Acts 8:22, and you can be forgiven. You don't have to worry about that anymore. You don't have to go through life worried about the judgment day, being afraid of going to the judgment and being lost. And so the first thing we need to do is examine ourselves and determine why we are afraid. And then if we find that we are afraid because of personal sin, we need to make it right. Perhaps more important than insight is our faith in God. We need to increase our faith in God. Let me, in closing, just mention some passages that we have noted for you to remember, and they can help you overcome this problem of fear. First of all, in Psalm 23 and verse 4, David said, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." 1 Peter 5 and 7, "Casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you." John 14 and 1, "Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me." 2 Timothy 1 and 7, "For God hath not given to us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." 1 John 4:18, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out fear." And so we need to turn to God and His Word, trust in His Word. The Bible illustrates how faith can overcome fear. You remember when the children of Israel first came to the land of promise, God said, "Go and take the land, I'll fight your battles for you and give you the land." But they were afraid to go in. They sent spies into the land to spy it out. When those spies came back, 10 of them says, "There are giants in the land. We're like grasshoppers in their sight. We're afraid to go in." God then calls them to turn back and wander in the wilderness for 40 years. When they came to the edge of Canaan the next time, they had learned a lesson. They had faith in God. They went into the land and conquered that land. The Apostle Paul teaches that we too need to have faith in God and His Word. And if there's something that God wants us to do, we can do it. In Philippians 4, verse 13, Paul said, "I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me." I do not understand that verse to teach that I can do just anything I want to do. If I wanted to fly through the air like Superman, I don't believe that passage teaches that I can do it. But if God wants me to do something, if God commands me to do something, I can do it. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me. And so let us increase our faith in God, believe in His Word, trust in His promises, and then we'll be able to remove that fear that's wrong out of our lives. I hope these thoughts will be of some benefit to you. We hope you'll be with us next week as we continue our studies together. Shall we close with prayer? Holy Father, we're thankful for Thy Word and for the confidence and assurance that we may receive from it. Help us, we pray, to have greater faith, believe in Your Word, trust in You supremely, and then we pray that we'll be faithful unto death, that one day we may live with You in heaven. We pray in the name of Christ. Amen.